I'm Daryl Mbakshi, the director of tonight's program on U.S. energy policy and the Clean Power Plan. I'm a JD MBA, a graduate of both the Chicago Booth School of Business and the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. I also serve as the director of marketing and regulatory program for the Alumni Law Society.
And a very warm good evening to all of you on a slightly blustery night here in Washington, D.C. My name is Claiborne Booker. I'm a graduate of Booth from class of 92. I'm co-chair of the Booth Energy Network, and we are the co-sponsor of tonight's program. We're delighted to have you here and look forward to a lively conversation.
Welcome to the second installment of our Alumni Law Society regulatory series on business and law. As you can see, we have a packed program tonight with lots to cover in a short amount of time. In 2005, the Alumni Law Society teamed up with Chicago Booth to explore the close relationship between business and law with its antitrust seminar and the impact of U Chicago economics as it played on shaping modern antitrust law. Tonight, we've partnered with the law school and the Chicago Booth Energy Network to explore one of the most pressing externalities of energy operations, carbon emissions and their effect on climate change. We'll explore the tools that industry and U.S. policymakers have at their disposal to control the side effect of business, be it regulation, taxation, and/or other economic mechanisms.
We will explore the legal underpinnings of the Clean Power Plan and other policy initiatives that we've looked at to curbing carbon emissions, including carbon taxation, cap and trade policies, and the administration's most recent proposal to put a tax on barrels of oil. We'll also explore how the Clean Power Plan in general impacts traditional energy providers and utilities as they look towards the future of a changed energy landscape, potentially far less coal and more renewables and other clean energy and natural gas operations. Finally, we'll take a dive into exactly what the Supreme Court's stay action really means and how the next 2 to 3 years will play out in energy policy in light of the stay and pending court actions ahead.
We have a wonderful lineup of panelists tonight, both graduates of the University of Chicago and others affiliated with U Chicago Thought, who will be introducing shortly. Thank you for joining us tonight with our host, Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman, for what should be a very comprehensive and interdisciplinary discussion of the business, legal, and economic dynamics surrounding the Clean Power Plan and U.S. energy policy. A few things before we introduce tonight's panel. If you could silence the cell phones, that would be great. That would help us out a lot. And also, we included an index card in everyone's folder. We kindly ask that we hold all the questions for our Q&A session at the end, if we can. And having said that, let's introduce our wonderful, wonderful panel tonight. Up first, we have Jean Kahn-Connor. Jean is a partner in the Environmental Practice Group at Kirkland & Ellis. She has a versatile practice and represents a broad range of clients in restructuring cases, environmental enforcement cases, compliance matters, corporate transactions, and bankruptcy operations. Jean is a 1984 graduate of the University of Chicago School of Law. Welcome, Jean. Next, we have Jeff Knight. Jeff is a partner in the Environment, Land Use, and Natural Resources practice at Pillsbury. He concentrates his practice in areas of environmental compliance counseling, risk management and business transactions, and environmental litigation. Jeff primarily counsels public and private companies as well as trade associations regarding the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act compliance and enforcement issues, risk management in business and real estate transactions, and air quality and toxic tort environmental litigation. Jeff is a 96 graduate of the University of Chicago School of Law. Next, we have Thomas Lorenzen. Thomas is a partner in Crowell & Mooring's Environmental and Natural Resource Group, as well as their Government Affairs Group. Prior to going into private practice, Tom worked at the Department of Justice, where he managed the legal defense of all EPA rules. Tom has overseen many of the seminal environmental cases of the last decade, including Massachusetts versus EPA, in which the Supreme Court affirmed the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, and Entergy versus Riverkeeper. Tom is a graduate of Harvard Law, and wonder why Harvard Law is here on our panel, but he mentioned that he has ties in the suburbs of Chicago, and we figured that's good enough. And Tom argues, he argues the environmental law cases frequently before the DC Circuit. Welcome to our panel, Tom.
Next up, let me introduce to Tom's left. It is Ed Comer, who is Vice President and General Counsel of the Edison Electric Institute. Here, he is a 1971 graduate of the college, and we're delighted to have him here to speak to us on his matters. EEI and its members work directly on critical policy issues affecting the entire electric industry. Between Gene and Jeff here is Tom Covert, who's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He's also been most recently involved with the Energy Policy Institute at Chicago, and one of his most recent working papers has been on the effects of hydraulic fracturing. So thank you, Tom, for being here. He's a graduate of Harvard and MIT, so we're happy to have him here. Actually, it's the other way around, is it MIT and then Harvard for the PhD. And then finally, from my side, is another University of Chicago Business School graduate, Richard Wilson III, who has his MBA from Booth and his work as a pricing and structuring analyst at Constellation Energy, which has over 2 million households that provides power. He's between Donald and Mark Templeton at the far end of our stage, and he'll be offering some of the industry perspective for us this evening.
Last but not least, before we introduce our moderator, is Donald Marin. Donald serves as the Director of Economic Policy Initiatives at the Urban Institute. He is also an Institute Fellow at Urban, focusing his policy research on tax reform, energy and the environment, and the financial crisis. Donald is a former member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors and the former acting director for the Congressional Budget Office. He is also a former professor of economics at Chicago Booth. In fact, he was my former professor. The good news about Donald is that if you want to learn more about his theories on economics, Donald is editor of 30-Second Economics, a short book that introduces readers to 50 of the most important theories in economics. And to introduce our moderator tonight, Mark Templeton. Mark's at the far end. Mark is the Associate Clinical Professor of Law and Director of the University of Chicago's Abrams Environmental Law Clinic. Prior to this role, Mark served as the Executive Director of the Office of Independent Trustees for the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Trust, where he ensured the $20 billion pledge by BP was available to address the claims of those affected by the 2010 Horizon oil spill. Mark also served in the cabinet of Missouri Governor Jay Nixon as the director of the Department of Natural Resources, leading the state's efforts in energy, environment protection, state parks, and water resources. He has also held positions at Yale Law and with McKinsey & Company. Mark is a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School. At this point, we're going to turn the floor over to Jeff Knight, who will begin with his overview of the Clean Power Plan. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome everybody. Just wanted to start very quickly by just setting the table, so to speak, with a brief summary of the Clean Power Plan, what it requires, why it's so unique and controversial, and then a very quick setting of the stage as to its current legal status to open up the discussion to the panel. So first, very quickly, most of you know, but for those of you who do not, Clean Power Plan is a set of regulations promulgated by EPA late last year, directed at states, and it instructs those states to adopt their own plans to implement reductions of CO2 emissions from existing coal-fired power plants. and it establishes a set of budgets for each state to meet those mandates over a fairly lengthy time planning horizon. Initial compliance dates in 2021, and then final compliance demonstrated by 2030. 47 states are subject to the rule, and EPA assigned each a CO2 budget based upon its projections of that state's internal energy production portfolio and certain levels of reductions that EPA believed that state could achieve. At the low end is Connecticut at about 7% reductions on a rate basis. At the upper end is Montana at, I believe, 47% reductions on a rate basis. The budgets overall, if you were to post this on a map of the United States, the greater reductions on a rate basis tend to be focused on the Midwest states and the Rocky Mountain states. On a mass basis, they tend to be focused more on Texas and the Rust Belt states. So obviously, to some degree, states that have larger burdens under the plan tend to be the states who are opposing the plan, and many of the states that have lesser burdens tend to be supporting the plan. So why is the Clean Power Plan sort of unique and controversial? Well, so it's the first set of national emission standards to reduce CO2 from the power industry. And it's a centerpiece of the current administration's climate change program. And as such, its supporters focus, of course, on the importance of reducing or addressing CO2 emissions from the power sector. CO2 emissions make up about 80 to 82% of the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So a significant sector, and supporters point to the importance of addressing CO2 emissions from that sector in any sort of meaningful or serious climate change plan. Opponents focus, of course, on the impacts to the power sector and the retirements that are likely to occur as a result of the mandates on states to meet their individual budgets. In order to achieve that mandate of about 32% on average over 2005 levels, EPA and pretty much everybody agrees that there will be a fairly historic shift away from coal-fired production, energy production, and an incredible focus on natural gas-fired production and on renewables, as well as some energy savings mandates or energy efficiency mandates as well. So this obviously will push many coal-fired plants into early retirement, which creates certain concerns about electricity grid reliability, jobs, and economics related factors depending on the states and their individual mandates. It's also a unique claim of legal authority by EPA under the Clean Air Act. And it's essentially EPA is asserting authority to mandate that states reconfigure their electricity generation in their states to meet these budgets. And that has impacts across the electric generation sector, but also really the entire economy, given how far those job and economic impacts will reach. So not surprisingly, given the controversy, within just a few days of the final rule being promulgated, bunches of parties lined up on both sides to both challenge and defend the rule in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. There are about 160 petitioners, including 27 states, challenging the rule, and then a number of environmental NGOs, a couple of utilities, and about 17 or 18 states who are in a support position for the rule. So petitioners fairly quickly filed motions in the DC Circuit seeking a stay, which would essentially, in effect, halt the implementation of the rule while the court considered its merits. The DC Circuit in mid-January denied that request for a stay, but did grant a fairly aggressive briefing schedule, as well as setting oral argument for June 2. Petitioners then took the most unusual step of requesting a stay of the Supreme Court. And I'm sure everyone here knows that the court granted that stay on February 6th. So as of today, implementation of the rule is on hold due to the Supreme Court stay until both the DC Circuit and the Supreme Court have completed their merits reviews of the rule. And really all eyes now are on the DC Circuit as the briefing is starting to unfold, and oral argument, I said, is set for January 2. So that's where we are, and I think I'll turn it over to Mark for the panel.
Can people hear me? Yes. Hear? Okay, great. So now I get to play, I don't know if it's like Bill Maher or somebody like that, the role of host and moderator that I've always wanted to for this kind of an audience. So I'm going to just say a couple of things to connect this back to campus, and then we'll go back to the Clean Power Plan and some of its implications. I run the Environmental Law Clinic at the law school. I have done that for 4 years. I have 16 students who work with me on projects related to environmental and energy issues. We actually are now in conversations with state regulators in the Midwest, as well as environmental justice organizations, all from a technical assistance perspective. And while the original plan had a couple of years for states to work out their plans for addressing these individual targets, I think that if there's a silver lining from one perspective on this, actually the benefit of having more time to think through these really complicated issues, such as do states want to go with a mass-based approach, or do they want to go with a rate-based approach? All of this, of course, depends upon what the courts ultimately decide and how U.S. EPA reacts to that. And certainly people have been talking about these things for a long time, but these are very complex issues. I feel quite lucky to be able to work on this with students to expose them to these kinds of issues. Also, just want to say on campus as well, just want to highlight the role of the Energy Policy Institute. It's been a presence on campus for several years, but particularly in the past couple of years has really become a focus for discussions on these and a whole host of energy issues. So I really want to thank the folks at EPIC for convening and all the different things that they do on campus, as well as participating tonight. I think just a couple of other general points before we jump into the discussion here. I think it's important that people bear in mind that the electricity sector has been a heavily regulated sector for a long time. There are unique aspects of it. I mean, clearly it is the backbone of industry, but also affects our ability for commerce and our homes, and it affects us, frankly, in every moment of our lives. But also because of the structure of the industry, it has always had very heavy regulation by the states through their public utilities commissions. And certainly in terms of environmental regulations, because these have been big discharging entities, have always been really a focus of environmental regulations. So in a sense, it's not super surprising that we are now, once again, talking about regulation of a critical industry in the United States. Just again, the structure of the discussion, we're going to talk, we've got a series of questions here. Again, I would ask you, if you have questions, please write them down on note cards. And we will collect them and then kind of synthesize the questions and pose them to the panelists later in the discussion. We'll pick up with the discussion about the stay, some of the legal issues associated with that, what industry, how industry may respond to the stay. We'll then talk about some of the alternatives in terms of regulating carbon pollution, such as tax, and not just in the electric sector, but other areas as well. And then if we have time, we'll also touch on the Paris climate talks and how that relates to all of this as well. So we have an action-packed agenda for tonight. So well, turning back to the Clean Power Plan for a moment, and actually sort of turn to Thomas first here to kick off our discussion. In Massachusetts versus EPA, the Supreme Court said that EPA had to respond to a request that was filed about a petition, basically whether EPA had to regulate greenhouse gases. And then in Utility Air Regulatory Group, the court upheld the regulation of greenhouse gases from anyways stationary sources. In other words, sources that were already going to be subject to the Clean Air Act's requirements, which is essentially 80%. And so a significant percentage under the Prevention of Significant Deterioration programs and other parts of the Clean Air Act. So you have essentially two Supreme Court cases essentially upholding regulation of greenhouse gases, at least encouraging potentially regulation of greenhouse gases, and then upholding some US EPA efforts. Yet we have the stay by the Supreme Court here. So, Tom, how do we reconcile this?
Why are we here?
Yes.
Well, okay, everyone I assume is familiar with Massachusetts versus EPA that says EPA has authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases. And I'm assuming some familiarity with the decision in Utility Air Regulatory Group versus EPA, which is that prevention of significant deterioration case. There's a third case that's out there, a third Supreme Court case that most people haven't really focused on, and it's called American Electric Power versus Connecticut. And what that case had to do with was during the period that EPA wasn't doing very much yet in terms of regulating greenhouse gases, some decided to start trying to find other means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They thought first of bringing nuisance suits against power plant owners saying, you are emitting greenhouse gases that is having an adverse effect on our communities, and we are going to use the tort law to try and stop you from emitting those greenhouse gases. And the Supreme Court in that case said, no, you can't bring those lawsuits. They are essentially preempted by the Clean Air Act. And the court specifically pointed to a section of the Clean Air Act that is actually the source of the Clean Power Plan, Section 111. Section 111 is not the basis for the rules that were at issue in the Massachusetts case, which was about motor vehicles, interestingly enough, or in the Utility Air Regulatory Group case, which is about the prevention of significant deterioration regulations. Well, those are mind-numbingly complex. Section 111 says that EPA can issue regulations that control both new sources of a pollutant. In other words, when you build something brand new, like a new power plant, what do you have to put on it to reduce its emissions? In this case, EPA has said partial carbon capture and sequestration, which is the latest, greatest technology that's under development, and also existing sources, and what can you make them do? In this case, the Clean Power Plan is all about existing sources. Now here's the rub, and here's why we're back before the Supreme Court and in the DC Circuit. The court didn't tell us how powerful a tool Section 111 is. As Jeff said, EPA is striving to get 32% emission reduction. To do that, you have to get fairly creative with the statute, and you have to assume it's a very powerful tool. The opponents of the rule contend, no, the tool is much more limited, that you can't require a restructuring of the industry. All you can make them do is apply technology or make an operational change at each individual unit to bring its emissions down. And if you take that very narrow view of this statute, you can maybe get 2 to 4% emission reductions. So that 28% difference is what this case is about. Now, why did the Supreme Court issue the stay? It issued the stay, I think, and I do have to disclose to you here that I am counsel for one of the parties that's challenging the Clean Power Plan, but I'm not speaking to you in that capacity tonight. I'm speaking to you as someone who's been studying this issue for years, who's been on both sides of it, having been responsible for Mass v. EPA at the government side and the UARG case at the government side, and now working on this side. I just want you to know what's going on. So in that UARG case, a 5-justice majority of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Kennedy, and significantly Scalia, said that EPA has to tread carefully. And the court said that it would look skeptically upon agency attempts to find broad authority in long existing statutes to regulate vast swaths of the American economy. Looks like they were talking about the Clean Power Plan, which takes a long existing section of the statute, section 111, that's been used very rarely and that contains very few words, and using that section to develop what really is a restructuring of the electric industry. So those 5 justices kind of fired a warning shot across the EPA's bow in the UARG decision. And the question was always going to be, would they view the Clean Power Plan as treading on very thin ice? The grant of the stay on February 9th indicates that those 5 justices, and indeed that stay was only issued by those 5 justices, the other 4 dissented from its issuance. Those 5 justices, I think, had grave legal doubts about the legality of the rule, or they wouldn't have issued it. 5 days later, the world changed. When Justice Scalia passed away, there is no longer a majority on the Supreme Court that would issue that stay. Had the court sat on that motion for 5 more days, we'd be in a different place right now. Having said that, the stay can't be lifted at this point because that would itself take 5 justices. That 5th justice is potentially Judge Garland. So that's where we are, that's why we're here, and that's why this is a very interesting case, because we're now going to define how powerful is that tool, Section 111.
Jeff, so is this really unusual? I mean, for the Supreme Court to step in like this in terms of issuing a stay?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so far as I've been able to determine and doing some research on it, and so far as I've read in everyone else's efforts to do the same, it's never happened before. So evidently, the Supreme Court has never stayed a regulation arising before the lower court, in this case the DC Circuit, had reached the merits of that decision. So it's very unusual. What it says at a practical level is that the Supreme Court is very likely to grant writ of cert to review the decision of the DC Circuit. What you need is 4 justices, and you have 4 justices who have indicated in granting the stay that they have grave misgivings regarding the rule, and sort of regardless of what the outcome is at the DC Circuit level, there's a very strong probability that Supreme Court will be reviewing the rule after the DC Circuit has reached the merits.
And do you agree with, I guess, Tom's view, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, Tom, for a second, but well, let me try, being a professor, that in the sense that the Supreme Court was laying markers in the earlier opinion, or sending signals.
Oh yeah, there have been a few signals. Again, Massachusetts v. EPA really wasn't talking about what are the tools in the toolkit that EPA can use to regulate greenhouse gases. Massachusetts v. EPA was getting to the authority of EPA to regulate greenhouse gases as a pollutant, generally speaking. When you're getting to the question of how powerful are the tools that the statute gives to EPA, there have been some markers laid down by several justices that they're going to look very carefully, especially because there's a lot of skepticism that going beyond 2 to 4% reductions is really within EPA's authority. You have to go beyond the fence line at that point, and you have to shift electricity production away from coal-fired power plants, which are the source being regulated. And we definitely know that there are justices who are very skeptical of that.
And I don't know if you have thoughts, either of you, on this, but some of the people on the other side would say, well, if you look at other actions that have happened under the Clean Air Act, for example, this is fuel switching, right? So basically, one of the results of the acid rain program was that it was a switch from sort of high sulfur coal to low sulfur coal as part of the compliance strategies. So I don't know if one of you have a view on any thoughts. Any thoughts on that particular argument?
Well, yeah, some thoughts. First of all, this is not a regulation that is about fuel switching. Coal-fired power plants are not required to switch over to natural gas. This is unique because all previous regulations under this section have been about taking a particular piece of technology and installing it at a plant and then running that to make that plant more efficient in terms of producing less pollution per unit of good produce. And also, they have never before placed an overall limit on emissions. You can run your plant 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, as long as the rate is coming down. Or you can make an operational measure. You can make your plant more efficient just by tweaking a bit. What is unique here is that this actually forces, well, let's put it this way. Section 111 is about making changes at an individual unit, a source, which is defined in the Act as a building, an installation, a facility, a structure, an individual thing. And what this rule does is it says, Unit A, coal-fired unit, we'd like you to shut down or curtail your operations somewhat, and instead we'd like that generation of electricity to come from Unit Z, which might be owned by somebody else, might in fact be in another state. Or we'd like both Unit A and Unit Z to shut down because they're both fossil fuel fired. Unit A is coal, Unit Z is gas, and we would prefer instead solar or wind generation. So it is quite novel. EPA has never done this before under the auspices of Section 111.
And Jeff, maybe if I can turn to you because you've got some Clean Water Act work as well that was mentioned. Is this part of a broader trend in the Supreme Court in terms of trying to send, at least in the environmental space, a signal to EPA that maybe it needs to not be pushing so far on some of its regulations? So, for example, I think about like the Rapanos case, the wetlands decision. Authored by Scalia, which has then led to a whole other big controversy. I know we're talking about air and energy, but there's this whole question of what are the waters of the U.S. So is this part of a broader set of signals from the...
I don't know that I would read too much into that. I mean, I think there are some big issues that, and primarily recently in the environmental space, that EPA has been working significant programs under both the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and frankly, when you look at recent case law dealing with the kind of deference that the court gives to an agency that when it's interpreting statutes, what you're seeing is a fairly consistent message from at least 5 justices. In a few cases, there have been 4 justices writing in dissent, questioning the breadth and scope of agency authority, generally speaking, broadly written. This one has been coming for a while, since 2009, right? In Massachusetts was 2009?
2007.
Thank you. So for a long time. So this was on the horizon. EPA's been working on it in a variety of steps. The Supreme Court has had multiple opportunities to send signals. And I think, obviously, those signals were intended. It's hard to read it otherwise. And I think you probably have seen some skepticism, generally speaking, as to the breadth of agency authority in other regulatory areas as well, whether it be waters of the U.S., whether it be the type of authority that EPA and other agencies have said that they have in filling gaps that are perceived in statutes when the language of the statute wouldn't necessarily suggest that the gap is there.
If I might, before we go on to the next question, there's a fascinating battle that's going on right now in the face of persistent congressional inaction and what that inaction means. The Clean Air Act, one of our major environmental statutes, was written in 1970 and was last amended by Congress in 1990. It is 26 years since the last amendment. And you have EPA grappling with problems that really weren't conceived of at that time. And the question that the Supreme Court is grappling with, and the DC Circuit will be grappling with, is what does that congressional silence mean? Does it mean the agencies shouldn't be permitted to try to find creative ways to address new problems? Or does it mean that the agencies are authorized to use those ambiguities to try and fit the statutes to current problems? This is the big battle at the Supreme Court. The death of Justice Scalia may change that calculus, because he has been, while a fan of what we call Chevron deference, he has been finding some ways to narrow it. And with him gone, it's not clear whether there will be 5 justices that want to continue that push, or whether we'll see again sort of a resurgence of deference. Judge Garland, the nominee, is a big fan of Chevron deference and letting agencies work with the ambiguities in statutes to fulfill an administration's purposes, whatever that administration may be, Democratic or Republican.
So we have a stay. The stay basically says until the Supreme Court acts again in terms of making a decision whether to lift the stay or actually makes a decision on the merits, there is a stay in place, right? So we'll have the DC Circuit decision at some point, right? So argument is beginning of June. Any sense of the timeline after that?
Timeline, okay, so yeah, so briefing is underway. The petitioners have filed their briefs, their initial briefs. All the briefing will be done in another month. And then oral argument is scheduled for June 2 and 3 if needed. At that point, it becomes, a little murky to predict timeframes, but I think you will see a decision out of the DC Circuit by as early as September, maybe October. And then, sort of irrespective of what the outcome is, the parties that were not successful are almost certainly going to file a petition for rehearing en banc. If the DC, which is a way in which you ask the full DC Circuit to consider the 3-judge panel's decision. And if that is granted, there could be an additional supplemental briefing and argument before the full en banc DC Circuit Court. But if that is not granted, then you're seeing a petition going to the Supreme Court in November, December. And just given the timing at which the court considers those writs, you're likely to see it granted in early next year. And then probably a decision by the end of next year, early 2018. I don't know if you have different predictions.
That's about the schedule that I'm looking at. It's possible you could get a Supreme Court decision by summer of next year, but that's a very ambitious schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So occasionally I look at the newspapers and I see that we've got something else going on in the country right now, aside from the Clean Power Plan, near and dear that might be to my heart. I think we've got an election going on. Gene, what I hear from Jeff and Tom is that we're not going to have decisions until after we have a new administration. How could a new administration, what might a new administration do that could change all of this?
Well, it's possible a new administration could try to dismantle it, but it's not likely. We really don't expect that. In order for the new administration to actually change the course of where things are now, basically the rule would be withdrawn. You'd have to go through a whole notice and comment period. For those of you who aren't well versed in how many comments there were originally, there were 4.3 million comments on the original rule. So it attracted a lot of attention, and this was a really long process. So I would envision the new administration not wading into this and letting the court process take its course and seeing what happens.
Any different perspectives on that?
No?
So Ed, what's industry going to do in the meantime about this?
there's a lot going on besides the Clean Power Plan that the industry's doing. And let me give you a little background on that. And just, I want to start with some basics to make sure as we talk about these different options, people understand it. There are a lot of different fuels that can be used to produce electricity. Coal is the one that produces the most carbon per ton. If you burn, and there's virtually no technology that can reduce that. That was the discussion that Tom talked about. There are efficiency measures that you can take that can reduce it. You can try, and Southern Company now is working on decarbonizing the coal as carbon capture and storage and move it underground. It is very, very expensive, and it is still not a very well-known technology. So the options are, if you burn natural gas, you produce roughly 50% the amount of carbon per unit of electricity that you get from coal. So if you switch from coal to gas, you get a 50% savings in carbon. If you switch to renewables, wind and solar and nuclear, and remember 20% of our power in the country comes from nuclear, there is no carbon impact. So just understand that the technology options are that when you move from coal to gas, you reduce carbon by half. When you move to renewables, you eliminate it, okay? And a lot of the discussion here about what EPA can do is, can EPA order utilities to move from one fuel to another? That's a real fundamental question. Was the Clean Air Act intended to do that? But let me tell you what utilities are doing in the meantime. We are switching rapidly from coal to both gas and renewables. Our utility use carbon emissions have declined 15% since 2005 to 2014, okay? That's virtually half the goal that is set up in the Clean Power Plan for 2030. Decline will be much greater in 2015 because we're using more and more natural gas. In 2050, 2005, 50% of your electricity came from coal. Now it's down to about 1/3, and that's a huge difference. We've basically stopped using 1/3 of our coal fleet, whether we've closed the plants or we're not running them as much. Most of the difference has been from natural gas. There's been a lot of renewables, particularly wind, some solar. And there's a lot of economics that goes into this. I mean, one of the biggest changes in all of this driver is yes, public policy plays a role in a lot of ways besides the Clean Power Plan, but low natural gas prices have been a huge driver. Gas, I see a lot of people shaking their heads. Gas is a lot cheaper than coal right now. And in places where gas is cheaper than coal, utilities who have the option and have gas plants with spare capacity are burning gas. And that's why you see a quick change. We're building more and more renewables. Wind in particular is huge. Ironically, some of the places, and I will cite Texas as one, it's one of the biggest wind generators in the country, all along the Great Plains, because it's windy out there and it's cheap to get electricity with wind out there. Texas, which is a huge opponent of the Clean Power Plan, is the biggest wind generator in the country. And I think recently they were about 40% of all their, at least just very short term, all their power that came from wind. So utilities are planning for the future. We're looking at policy, but we're also looking at economics, okay? And if the economics are such that it's going to be cheaper to produce clean power, we're going to do that. That's what our customers want. Policies, there are a lot of different policies that have incented that. There are federal tax incentives, both for solar and wind. There are renewable portfolio standards in a lot of different places, and a lot of states have things like that, different kinds of state incentives that we haven't talked about yet. And that's what our customers want. You get some of the our biggest customers these days are folks like Microsoft, Amazon, folks who have data centers. They want to go green, utilities will go green for them, and we'll figure out a way to do that that's cost effective. So if you look at the technology innovation that's going on, and DOE is putting a lot of money into it, Bill Gates has put a lot of money into it with a couple of his billionaire friends, the future is going to be cleaner no matter what happens with the Clean Power Plan. It may not be the precise targets and timetables that EPA has prescribed, but right now it's probably going a lot faster than anybody anticipated when we were talking about a cap and trade bill back in 2009. And the utility industry is far ahead of virtually any other sector in America in reducing carbon emissions.
And so, I don't know, Richard, Ed, if you want to say more about this, or Richard, if you want to jump in, but how is it affecting like the investment decisions at this moment, meaning the Clean Power Plan and the stay, and how is it affecting any decisions at the margin, or are these trends just, inevitable and it's not really, whatever, Clean Power Plan is what it is, but it's not really affecting?
In the short run, it adds a bit of uncertainty, unfortunately, because you don't quite know if you're going to have to do it or not. And so there are marginal places where, yes, it makes decision-making much more difficult, okay? It varies, again, from state to state. Utilities and vertically integrated utilities have to work with their states when they make investment decisions because they're regulated. That's going to continue. Competitive markets, I think things are going to be much more complex because folks who invest in competitive markets are putting their own money up. And frankly, I think when you're investing somebody else's money, people don't like risk. And that may actually move more to clean energy if it's cheaper.
Can you just, for those people who are not as familiar with the electric industry, talk about what you mean when you say a competitive industry, competitive markets?
About half the country, and it varies, but this area, wholesale generation of electricity in most of the mid-Atlantic states, the Northeast, New England, New York, California, and Texas, generation is bid competitively in a government-regulated market at market prices. The market is sort of like the stock market in some ways. The rules are set and people bid their prices and everybody sells at that price. Building generation in those markets is pretty risky, okay? And the rest of the country is more vertically integrated. Utilities, before they invest, will need approval of their state regulatory commissions. And in those places, whatever we do will be run by the state, no matter whether or not the Clean Power Plan is in effect.
So in other words, in the competitive markets, you get the market price, even if the company's making an investment in this highly capital, intensive enterprise, long-lived asset.
You get the market price, and it's very hard to make investments, big investments long-term, having a lot of uncertainty about what the market price will be. You basically, unless you can sign a long-term contract with someone, you know the way the markets work, about 3 years out, and that's not a lot of time. Ironically, one of the sort of unfortunate impacts of low power prices is making it very difficult for some of the nuclear power plants to continue operating. And a number have shut down. So there are some others that are just may shut down in the future, and that would be a loss of carbon-free power. So it's a very complex picture depending on individual economics of both the plants, the submarkets you're operating in, and the rules that you're operating under. It makes it very difficult to make decisions.
Yeah, I want to add a few things. So you mentioned how we are already about 15% below 2005 levels. 2005 was one of, if not the, most emissions, the highest emissions years that we've had. So even without the Clean Power Plan, with the production tax credits, the investment tax credits for wind and solar, with low natural gas, we would probably hit the targets that are in that plan without it even existing. And that's status quo. So when you start to see changes, if gas prices go up, then that could change the economic incentives for coal units. They'll start emitting more. That's where the Clean Power Plan starts to have more teeth than it may currently. If people aren't familiar with what he was talking about, how the economics for these investment decisions are made, with low natural gas, historically natural gas has been at the margin. So when we talk about these competitive markets, natural gas units historically set the price, so coal units were cheaper. And so with a price higher than their marginal cost, they were making more money than they had in the past. With low gas prices, these natural gas units are now lower in the stack. So these coal plants aren't running as much as they would have or making as much as they would have otherwise, because power prices have been suppressed both by low gas and the investments and the proliferation of renewable energy. So the coal units have to make a decision. Are they going to invest in the technologies to become cleaner, to meet I guess one of the building blocks is what they call the heat rate improvement, making these plants more efficient. Are they going to invest in that? And with the risk surrounding that deal, it may not make business sense to put those investments in place. It may make more sense to just shut or not run the plant. And part of that is what will help us reach these targets. But, that's also saying that natural gas isn't going to spike, which when we look forward, natural gas is around $2 to $3 now. Even if we look 10 years out, we don't see prices getting above, say, $4, which, really makes it harder for coal plants to survive. Without any of these policies in place.
Tom, I know you have written about shale gas, fracking and all of that, which I think if we'd been having these discussions about the Clean Power Plan and what could have been achieved 10 years ago before the fracking revolution, it might have been a very different discussion, right? Because just for those who are not aware, right, natural gas as well as renewable prices have dropped by about 60% over the past 7 to 8 years, plus or minus. So it's a very different world from, again, even a decade ago. So, Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
So there's a couple things to note, especially with respect to natural gas prices.
I don't know if you can speak closer.
Is this better? Yes. There's a couple things to note about gas prices over, I would say, really the last decade is the right time frame to look. So one of the things is that two hurricanes that happened in the United States in sort of 2006 time frame, those were responsible for some pretty drastic increases in the price of natural gas. It took a long time to sort of play out. So some of what we have seen in the decrease in gas prices is not purely attributable to fracking, but nevertheless, I think that quite a bit of what we actually have seen is a result of this huge supply expansion coming out of the Mid-Atlantic region and in the Southeast and in parts of Texas as well. This is a sort of a technology shock that certainly couldn't have been anticipated in 2005 or earlier than that. And even as some of these plays sort of started to build out in the mid part of the last decade, it was really unclear how big they were actually going to be. Some of the work that I've done to sort of suggest that we're sort of probably in the very beginning of the building of these plays. Most of my research is actually about the sort of implication of this new technology in the oil sector, but I think it applies just as equally to gas. So I think that Richard's assessment, or Richard's forecasting team's assessment of low gas prices to come is a pretty reliable one. There's a lot of gas in the Southeast that basically has been drilled and capped, and the owners of those wells, to the extent that they have the ability to wait out low prices, are sort of hoping to sort of wait that out. There's a lot of gas that, was originally planned to be drilled in the last decade that those plans have been shelved, again, holding out for higher prices. And I think that, the fact that there's all those assets in the ground that are just waiting for $4 gas or something like that, which 10 years ago would have been a dream if you were an electricity buyer anyways, means it's probably unlikely that we're going to be seeing high gas prices anytime soon. That's what I'm saying.
And do you have a thought on how the stay actually affects some of these investment decisions? I mean, does it kind of work its way all the way back up back into the drilling decision?
I could think of a very third or fourth order relationship if you want me to speculate. So one thing, one way you could imagine the stay affecting gas investment, and I realize this may be a little bit tenuous, is if you think the stay eventually leads to a carbon market in the United States, and that's going to sort of drive a bigger wedge between the cost of coal and gas, you might imagine that could lead to more gas demand. So a stay basically increases the amount of uncertainty there's going to be about whether or not you get that additional wedge. And most economic models of investment are going to basically make the prediction that when you've got more uncertainty, you're going to wait longer. So there's a sense in which, again, very tenuous, certainly not first order sense, but there's a sense nonetheless in which the stay, could be associated with a slowdown of investment plans for gas wells in the United States anyways.
Don, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, thanks. I mean, sort of, I guess for big picture, thinking about this as a matter of economic policy, the thing that strikes me from this day and from the discussion of the design of the Clean Power Plan more generally is how much it's a square peg, round hole kind of problem. That the Clean Air Act is an incredibly awkward way to try to deal with carbon emissions and climate change more generally. And our politics have led to that being the best path in this administration's view to make some progress. But really, what I think as an economist you ought to take from this discussion is, wow, it would be nice if we actually had comprehensive legislation that was intelligently and intentionally trying to address these issues, rather than trying to do it awkwardly through the Clean Air Act, where people have what sound like legitimate questions about, is the authority there or not? I can't judge those. I have no particular opinion, but just...
It's good to dream, yes.
Well, just, it would be nice if it were unambiguous that our climate policy was legit. And we'll talk about later also efficiency. And there are a lot of reasons to think that a comprehensive, intelligent policy laid out could actually be much more efficient. Then there's also a political economic concern. And this depends on what you think the constellation of powers is in the future. But if the stay is a signal that the Clean Air Act approach is in trouble, you can look at a future where, on the one hand, the folks who want to combat climate change and want to regulate are going to be in the market for an alternative. And if your model of the future is that they're going to have power, this will give them an incentive to go out and do cap and trade or carbon tax or whatever other thing we could come up with. On the other hand, if your view of the political economy is that the opponents of regulation have the upper hand, then this is really unfortunate, right? Because there was a view that if you had a regulatory approach, particularly one that was mean and nasty and inefficient and horrible, which isn't exactly what we got, but it was those things, that it might actually be leverage ultimately for pursuing a more comprehensive way of dealing with this, that folks who oppose action in general might be more willing to do it if they got rid of a regulatory approach that they didn't like. So depending on your view of which of those two folks have the upper hand in the future, this either does or does not increase the possibility of doing more wholesale reform.
Let me just point out one more thing, following up on Don. We're now, with the Clean Power Plan, just talking about the electric sector, which accounts for, about 40% of all the country's emissions. But there are a lot of other emissions out there from a lot of other sectors that haven't gotten touched by this. I mean, EPA has tried to promote greater efficiency in motor vehicles. I mean, just as a way to reduce emissions and save fuel and all of that. But there are still tons of other sectors we just don't deal with at all under the Clean Air Act approach we're talking about.
Actually, I want to pick up for a second on one thing which Don mentioned, which was kind of a more comprehensive approach. I mean, Ed, right now, there are a number of different state approaches out there in terms of renewable, and you've mentioned some of this, right, in terms of renewable portfolio standards, where states basically say a certain percentage of the energy has to come from renewable sources, energy efficiency standards, where basically a certain amount of demand has to be met by energy efficiency. So I guess my question is, there's already regulation taking place here in this patchwork kind of way. Would it be better to have a comprehensive approach, and that something like the Clean Power Plan would have offered?
Economically, it would be better to have a consistent approach. Politically, I don't know that would happen. Okay, I have to take the politics into account, but a lot of these more ad hoc approaches, and I'll look to the economist on the group, tend not to be very cost effective, and that varies from place to place. Okay, it may be very cost effective to have solar in Arizona or California and make no sense at all in Maine. Okay, because your location does affect the economics of what you're doing. So the one advantage you get out of a cap and trade system or a trading system is you do get a more efficient economic approach. And we should say, nobody, when we talked about this whole Clean Power Plan, at least the proposal that is now frozen, ended up in EPA's ideal world in some sort of trading program. And there are tremendous advantages to trading programs, particularly for utilities, because if we get stuck, sometimes you need to operate a very specific plant for reliability purposes. And if you have specific constraints on that plant, you can get stuck. But if you can trade allowances or whatever, it gives you a lot more flexibility.
And so is everybody clear what reliability is, right? Reliability is what keeps the lights on. I used to live in this area and remember lots of arguments about the reliability of electricity after storms and things like that. And I think no matter what one's perspective is, it is true that the utilities for a long, long time have been told that reliability is their first, second, and third priority, fitting cost in there somewhere as well. So the idea is always making sure that there is sufficient power to meet demand. That's kind of the point about reliability. So maybe I can go back to Tom here for a second. Are there, I guess, combination question. So one is kind of a legal perspective, one may be more of a policy perspective. So from a legal perspective, are there parts of the plan that survive? Is it that you think would survive? Is it really just the inside the fence line piece that you think might survive the challenge? Are there other parts of this? And then to kind of relate it a little bit to what Ed was saying, what I heard was that if there's going to be regulation, there are advantages to having a trading kind of approach. That was something that, while EPA wasn't requiring it, because right, they were setting rates and pushing it down to the states, there was certainly a strong thumb on the scale, I guess I think one would say, on it. So I guess perhaps both sort of the legal and the policy piece. So
from the legal perspective, what's the most likely to survive? That building block one, inside the fence line, the technology-based and operational measures-based requirements that you can impose on a plant. That's traditional best system of emission reduction that EPA has used over the years. That's quite likely to survive, but it doesn't get you very far. That's the problem with it. The overall structure of the rule might survive. There is a fundamental legal question here, and again, I'm not speaking as an advocate today. I'm just telling you sort of different perspectives on the law. One of the first arguments in this case is about whether EPA has any authority at all to regulate power plant emissions of greenhouse gases while they are at the same time regulating power plant emissions of what we call hazardous air pollutants like mercury. And that's a fundamental legal issue. I think there's a significant chance the rule survives that challenge. Now, my own clients are arguing that no, it doesn't. But let's assume for the moment that EPA's authority could be confirmed, that they can regulate, that they can use this tool. Then you've got building block one at least. You might also have sort of the form of the rule, which is that EPA can dictate to the states individual budgets that they have to go out and implement. That's also a contested issue here. But it's possible that will survive. What is most at jeopardy is this generation shifting that EPA has expressly avowed in this rule. The idea that you can tell one company, your form of generation is now disfavored. We'd like you to shift your generation or subsidize generation by some other company that uses a different form of generation. That's significantly at risk. In terms of policies,
I mean, if you're really putting technology in place, would you still have, would you have anything you need to trade, I guess, at that point? Is that kind of a...
well, the technology doesn't get you very far. That's the problem. So you need something else. One of the things that I think is going to happen here, just talking policy for a moment, if this rule survives judicial review, it is not, as our other panelists have said, as Donald said earlier, perhaps the best way one can imagine regulating carbon dioxide emissions. I think there might be a bit of an uproar to Congress from those asking Congress to come up with something more sensible. Maybe a carbon tax, maybe a cap and trade program that's specifically designed for CO2. By the same token, if the rule goes down, either entirely or because you can't go outside the fence line to get more than 2 to 4% emission reductions, I think there's going to be significant pressure from industry, which wants certainty and a level playing field, and from our international negotiating partners for congressional action to come up with something that actually does get meaningful greenhouse gas emission reductions. Again, perhaps a carbon tax, perhaps a cap and trade program. I think either way, there's going to be pressure on Congress to rethink the tools that are specifically available for carbon dioxide emission reductions.
Jeff, do you have thoughts on both sort of...
I agree. I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that is my personal view is that probably the rule stands or falls as a whole. Absolutely right that the traditional, you can get 3% inside the fence line is the least objectionable from a legal perspective. It doesn't get you very far. But I don't know that there's really going to be much of a basis for a court trying to figure out the remedy here, to parcel out those pieces, order parts of it, either remanded or vacated. The reality is a court is really going to have a difficult time fashioning that remedy, carving out the part that may not be as bad and getting rid of the other parts. I think probably what you will see is it will stand or fall as a whole.
Yeah, I agree with Jeff on that, absolutely. The court's not going to pick and choose which parts of the rules stand or fall and then bless some portion of this thing. If it falls as a whole, but they'll tell EPA which portions of the statute they can use to get emission reductions. They may say you can do something that's like these heat rate improvements, building block 1, and then leave it to EPA to determine how much they can get. Now, I will tell you that Gina McCarthy and Janet McCabe, head of EPA and head of the air program at EPA, have sort of suggested that they think they can squeeze a lot more out of building block 1 if they have to. So look for them to try to do that if the court says that's your only tool.
Jean, do you have thoughts on this?
Well, in terms of the practical consequences that flow from this, at least for this time period, while this period of uncertainty until we see whether it's going to be building block 1 that's upheld or more of the rules upheld. I think that the alignment of the coal industry. I think the alignment, sorry about that, that's a no-no. The realignment in the coal industry is going to continue in terms of those less efficient coal-fired plants closing down or on their own moving to cleaner sources of power. And I know from my own experience, and I'll just give one example of, this was a large energy restructuring company, and it was Edison Mission Electric owned several coal-fired power plants in Illinois. And this, they filed for bankruptcy at the end of 2013. And during the course of trying to determine which facilities should continue, which should not. Two of their Illinois facilities had already been shut down and were in the decommissioning phase. And for those two, we actually were looking at redevelopment, reuse, that type of thing. But for the others, we were trying to make an analysis of what to do and how to move forward. And at that point in time, and maybe many of you remember this, depending upon how closely you follow the industry, NRG came in and purchased EME out of bankruptcy and therefore purchased these many coal facilities that had been owned by EME's subsidiary, Midwest Generation. And what's interesting is what NRG Energy then, a year or two later, decided to do, because it really shows what's happening in the industry. Two of the facilities that had not already been closed down were retrofitted. One converted to natural gas, and one was closed down. And that's really where we're seeing practically how things are playing out moving forward. One other thought is that, again, during this time, what we're also seeing is that lenders are really grappling with how to evaluate lending funds to coal facilities. And just even today, there was an article in the New York Times about one more bank getting very cautious about lending. In this instance, it was to new coal-fired plants. But still, there's an indication that even in this time with the stay, we don't have the Clean Power Plan in effect. It's still having its impact in a lot of different areas.
So, as you were saying, we see some plants being shut down, we see some being switched to natural gas. Ed, is that actually useful in terms of switching to natural gas? Because with renewables, there's some intermittency issues. And so, and maybe Richard, you've got some thoughts on this as well. I mean, are there ways in which these forces can work together to support a change?
Well, the technologies get complex in a lot of ways. And renewables are very attractive, but both wind and solar don't run all the time, and you don't all of a sudden when it's going to be up, particularly if you're in the desert. But we need units that can run, back those plants up when the clouds come over or the wind stops. We need different kinds of technologies, even using natural gas, that can turn on really quickly and get up really quickly. So we need those technologies. We also have to be cautious. We can bring in more and more renewables than we thought even 10 years ago, but we have to be cautious about relying too much on natural gas if 10, 20 years down the line somebody says, well, you have to capture the carbon out of that. Okay. So we always talk about trying to have a balanced portfolio, just like you balance your stock portfolio, to have enough flexibility to adjust. Prices may well change. Things may happen that you've never expected, and frankly, that is going to happen, and you have to have flexibility for that.
Richard, you?
In a mega sense.
Yeah, I want to add one thing Ed mentioned earlier was that a lot of our nuclear plants are being affected by current prices. One thing that the Clean Power Plan does that a carbon tax, a cap and trade would do is it puts some kind of price on carbon, whether it's a perfect plan. Most people probably agree it isn't a perfect plan, but it does that effectively, and what that would allow is for some of those nuclear plants to become more economically viable. If those plants go away, and if we're substituting renewables with some natural gas to back them up for nuclear, we're essentially making our generation portfolio dirtier because we're adding natural gas. And if we are removing more nuclear, it's going to be very difficult to hit some of the targets that we've laid forth with the Clean Power Plan.
So, well, with coal, we may, in some cases, be having early retirements, although the average life of a coal plant is, 42 years or something like that, I read last year in the Washington Post. Nuclear, we actually may be extending as a way of dealing with this issue. Is that correct?
Yes, we would be extending, and if if we had a price on carbon, there are a lot of inefficiencies in markets. So Chicago booth, all they preach is efficient markets. If you don't fully price something, your market is inherently inefficient. So since in the absence of a price on carbon, in the absence of pricing pollutions into the total price, there's some inefficiency, and it's causing some, in economic talk, I guess, externalities that are undesirable.
What's the impact on ratepayers, though? I guess is a question that I have. I mean, how do you, can you say more about how you all think about that as you look at these different plans?
So that's very complicated, I would say. So when you look at the plans, there could be an increased cost of power if you add this cost of carbon to it, whether it's through plants having to buy allowances or credits, whether it's mass or rate-based. If you have more penetration of renewables, there are probably going to be some transmission investments that are going to be required. That'll probably factor into the rate. But what we've seen in, say, like the RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, was they saw increases in prices, but they saw that bills were lower. And a lot of that had to do with investments in efficiency or bill credits. So if the state owned the allowances, and for instance, if they auctioned them off, they could use some of the revenue from those auctions to subsidize bills. They could use some of it to invest in energy efficiency measures. So even though the cost of your power goes up, your total usage would go down, and your net effect would be you would be paying less. So it's, I mean, it depends. If they use the money for something else, then maybe your bill still goes up, but maybe you save somewhere else and avoiding some tax increases. I'm not sure, but I guess there are a lot of variables, and I wouldn't say I'm an expert there, and I would say that it's still undetermined what the net effect would be, especially this far out, since it wouldn't start, I believe, 6 years from now for the Clean Power Plan.
I don't know, Ed or Tom or Don, you have any thoughts on that? Ratepayer?
Well, it's very region-specific and state-specific, depending on what resources you have and what's available. And depending on what the price of fuels like natural gas are. There are places that use a lot of coal. The change is going to be significant for ratepayers, customers. But it also depends on what the cost of the alternative technologies are. And they've come down a lot quicker. If we were talking in 2009 about CCS, it would have been a much larger impact on everybody. The fact that gas, renewables, wind are all a lot less expensive helps mitigate those impacts. There's a lot more going on in the utility space because we're spending a lot of time and money both on resiliency and cybersecurity, and there are going to be impacts from that as well. And the amount of power that the country is using in the aggregate is not growing. So when it's growing, it's easier to spread higher costs, but right now it's not growing, and most people project that it won't because we're being more efficient. And I'll just tell you, look at the lights up there and look at this. You know, this has enough, more power than, you know, the early Univacs and stuff, and doesn't use a lot of electricity. Those things make a huge difference too, and all of that really feeds into what prices will be at the end.
Yeah, one thing I want to add too is the whole industry is expected to change. So the old model was you have a power plant out in the middle of nowhere and transmission lines and distribution lines that get that power to where it's used. And a lot of the forecast for the industry is moving to more of a distributed model where you have more solar on the homes, more localized resources, which then also makes it more challenging on how do some of these companies or utilities get paid back for some of the investments that may be needed if they are investing in renewables, because you can't control where the wind blows. And most of the wind is blowing somewhere where you need to have transmission investments. I mean, when you look at Texas, they're pushing up against the capacity for some of their transmission lines, and more investments are going to be required there. Solar is probably, I mean, I think it allows for more distributed resources. I mean, you still have some utility scale solar, but just with the change of the model, and that's impacting load growth, just because people aren't drawing as much from the grid with a combination of like on-site resources and efficiency and just better appliances.
My advice to the young folks in the room and everywhere is don't be a lawyer, don't be an economist. Put your brains into the technologies and invent the technologies of the future that, like better storage and cheap storage that can really make a difference, because it's technology more than these policies that ultimately will move the difference about what we can do and what it'll cost, okay? Policy will set a framework for that, markets will set a framework, but technology is the game changer.
I'll second that career advice. But I will say, though, that being an economist can be fun if you do it right. Just on the ratepayer question, since my role is in part to be the cold-hearted, green eye-shade economist here, I will note that if prices go up to ratepayers in any intelligent way of combating climate change, that's part of the solution, right? That you want prices to be higher so people have an incentive to use less, invest in efficiency, and all those things. It's important to think about ways to perhaps lessen the impact on consumers, right? Particularly low-income consumers. You want to think about ways so that you're not excessively harming them. But you should also try to keep in mind ways of doing that still nonetheless get the price signal right to them so everyone has an incentive to cut back on their electricity use to the extent that it's produced using carbon.
I was going to add one thing.
Is it fun being an economist, Tom?
I highly recommend it. So I was gonna respond to your question about the effect on ratepayers. If you actually look at the dollars that have actually gone into the subsidies for wind and solar, most of them take the form of of tax credits at the federal level, as opposed to. Sorry, most of those incentives, I think, take the form of tax credits at the federal level, as opposed to RPS rationalizing mechanisms at the state level. So to the extent that they show up in our wallets is actually not especially transparent. So that's sort of one thing. So to the extent that the Clean Power Plan, if it goes through, or if a successor to it goes through, and the mechanisms by which we get more of this clean power have the flavor of the existing incentives that we have, it's not clear that they show up directly on ratepayer bills. The second thing I would add, and this is not a thing that the utility industry has done yet, but it is, I think, nevertheless a thing worth considering, is that because most of the costs in renewable technologies are fixed costs as opposed to variable costs, you might sort of ask whether or not the way that these investments get recouped should show up on a fixed basis as opposed to a variable basis, which is the way it has sort of so far played out. And those things are going to be different things to smaller ratepayers versus bigger ratepayers.
What's going to be necessary from a transmission perspective if we were to see more of this move to renewables as well? I was actually just talking with a former student of mine about some truisms in environmental law, which is that basically you don't have the federal government coming in and doing land use regulation. But you do have FERC, which is involved in siting decisions. So some of these truisms are actually not so true after all. So I guess I was wondering what would be needed from a transmission perspective for some of these.
Transmission siting is regulated by the states. FERC can approve transmission rates, but while it has siting authority for gas pipelines, not for transmission, and it is a very difficult deal to get siting approval for really long lines that go from production to load in places like the Great Plains. Although I would say at the same time, I think it can be done. It'll take longer, but it could be done. I think there's still a big debate out there whether it's more cost effective to do that or to have more localized generation, wind and solar. And there are tons of debates about how you price all of those things that are very complicated and who pays for it. Do the producers, the generators, pay for it, to the customers pay for it, to the people in between. And politically, those are very difficult decisions when you have multiple states engaged as well. So it's just, that's one of the reasons that the way the Clean Power Plan timelines came out, the first real goal was 2022. In terms of planning and operating and getting things done, that's tomorrow. All right, it takes years to get those kind of, 5 to 7 years to get approval for a transmission line is not unusual. And even gas pipelines are running into all kinds of opposition these days.
And I think that's one of the interesting things about this. It's not actually the time it takes to build a new gas turbine or a wind farm or a solar installation. It's the transmission. It's getting that gas to the turbine and through pipelines that have to be sited and all the environmental review that entails, or getting the electricity from the wind or solar farm or even that new gas turbine to the market. That takes years, and it's very complicated, it's very contentious. That's why the long lead times in the Clean Power Plan.
Do we think we're going to see changes in kind of the industry structure coming related either to the Clean Power Plan or some of these other forces at work? I don't know, Ed or Richard?
The biggest change that I see right now is there's more consolidation between companies that own both electricity interests, whether it's the distribution lines or generation, and natural gas interests. There have been a series of mergers and consolidations, and I think people expect that will continue.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think with a lot of the uncertainty in, say, the competitive space, especially with where prices are headed, there's been a lot of focus on maybe consolidating more in the regulated space, where you can get those rates of returns that some of the companies are looking for in a steady, like, profit margin.
And I should say, it's not a merger type situation, but there is a tremendous amount of collaboration, I think, going on with end-use utilities and all kinds of technology companies in the storage space, in the management space, control space, and all of that, is not very visible, but obviously it's going to continue. Utilities are not going to be risk takers in that, but they're going to coordinate with all of these other technology companies, because technology does help us run the systems better, no matter what generation we're using.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's natural because a lot of the products are just new. And you find companies that may be good at one thing and another company that's good at another, and maybe collectively they could have a product that's viable. But, I mean, there's just a lot of experimentation going on. I mean, if you just look at battery storage, like, nobody's figured that out. But as some companies make a little bit of progress, it may behoove somebody to try to bring some of that in-house, and they get together, make more progress. So you would definitely see that, especially with the new technologies as the industry's changing.
Gene, did you have any additional thoughts from your kind of restructuring experiences?
Well, from the restructuring perspective, there's certainly been a huge increase in bankruptcies by some of the large coal companies. Just in the last year, there have been 3 or 4, and the last week, another company announced, which is a very large coal mining company. And in part, that has been precipitated, the recent announcement, this was Peabody Mining Company, was precipitated in part by the problems with financing that I alluded to a few minutes ago. So I think we are going to see a large range of coal mining company restructurings. And as well, just as in the example I gave of the coal-fired generation plants really struggling, I would expect that companies that have large portfolios of coal-fired plants may also be entering into some kind of restructuring. Sometimes a company, though, will enter into will restructure its finances, but not actually, file and go into bankruptcy. So there could just be a more general restructuring as the whole realignment of the industry, takes place.
So I want to shift to this question about other approaches from the kind of regulatory approach and, putting a tax on. And actually, one of the most relatively recent moves was the proposal by the Obama administration to put a tax on oil. And so, I think, Don, you've written about this a bit. We're wondering about your kind of thoughts about that particular piece, and then kind of thinking about taxes as another approach to dealing with these kinds of issues.
Sure. So, so the modern age is I now get credit for having written about this based on one tweet I sent, which was then picked up and amplified in the media.
It was a great tweet, though.
It was a great.
It's amazing what you can say, right?
Highly retweeted tweet. Right, so somewhat to surprise, the president announced as part of his budget this year a proposal for a $10 per barrel tax fee on oil. Stop and do the math in your head for a moment. Right, so 42 gallons in a barrel of oil. You actually have to mark that up a little bit because the oil, that for various reasons, refined product is actually slightly more than that. So that's the moral equivalent of about 22 cents per gallon for gasoline, diesel, and other refined products that come out of oil. Not that they presented it that way; they presented it as $10 a barrel. So this was an interesting proposal because 22 cents per gallon is roughly in the same order of magnitude as a $20 per ton carbon tax. Per ton of CO2. So you could think about it as being, given that the administration is in the box that they have to pursue climate-related policies through a somewhat piecemeal, a lever here, a lever there kind of approach. This could be viewed from one perspective as a way to try to propose a roughly $22 a ton carbon tax that would apply just to oil. They designed it so that it would apply to oil that ends up being combusted, whether it's gasoline, diesel, or select other refined products. Another way you could look at it is there is this long-running soap opera in America about the gasoline tax and about highway spending and about whether it's possible to raise the gasoline tax. The gasoline tax has been 18.4 cents per gallon at the federal level. Diesel, it's a little bit higher since the early 1990s. Not indexed to inflation, hasn't gone up. The base has been expanded a couple times slightly. But it's just something that is politically so incredibly hard to do, raising the gasoline tax, that I think part of what may have motivated the administration to put this on the table was that it's a tax that is a very close substitute for a gasoline tax, but the politics around it are a little bit different. The marketing around it is different. For those of you who remember the great debate over health reform included in it a tax on insurance companies for high-cost insurance plans. That was actually to address something that bothers economists about the tax treatment of the insurance plans we all get through our employers. But the politics were that it was much more attractive if instead of making it appear that you were taxing human beings, you were instead taxing big insurance companies. And there's a little bit of that going on with proposing to tax oil as well, as it sounds at first order like you're taxing oil companies and countries we import from. Every card-carrying economist will tell you about tax incidents and about how things get passed through, and ultimately everything's paid by people, and corporations are people too, my friend, and ultimately it all has to go to people. But it's a different way if you view it through the kind of highway gasoline tax kind of framing of issues, it was a different way of framing something that is really a very close substitute, except it covers gasoline, diesel, and other combusted fuels all at once in an interesting way. Some of you may be surprised it came up tonight because I bet most of you have already forgotten it was there, right? So you may have noticed it. It was leaked a couple days before the budget came out and then hasn't been heard from because it's not something the current Congress is going to consider. But I think it is an interesting way of thinking about if you're living in a world where you have to do things piece by piece and you need to reframe things in order to make them at all politically viable. It's an interesting way to try to take something you really want to do, tweak it slightly, and kind of float it as a trial balloon to see if it would be more politically viable.
I think the only thing I would add to that is so for me the most interesting thing about the Clean Power Plan and how we actually do think about it as basically a cap and trade program, that's most of what's in the regulation, is that there is a single mention in the actual final plan document of the possibility of states using a tax mechanism. So if you flip to page 889 of 1,600 or so pages or something like that, there's a footnote that suggests the possibility that states could implement a performance plan using the tax mechanism. And the reason why I sort of bring this up is that I know that Don has also written some stuff about the trade-offs between doing a cap and trade burden versus a tax, and so hoping we might be here a little bit about that too. I'm also of the opinion that it would be a lot administratively more simple and perhaps provide slightly better investment incentives to have a stable tax versus the volatile incentives that you might get out of a cap and trade program. But I find it interesting that the political community sort of coalesced around this idea that a cap and trade program is probably better than a fee system or a tax system. And I'm sort of curious to hear from the other panelists what they think about that.
When we were debating the climate bills 2009, I think it was very clear that the environmental community much preferred a cap and trade program because the cap gave them the certainty about how many emissions there would be. And one of the uncertainties about a tax is depending on how the technologies change, you may or may not get the emission reductions that you want. And there was a lot of uncertainty there, and they were not happy with that. And the truth is, if you look at the projections back then and what's happened now, everybody was wrong in things like technology and prices and all of that. So just from the environmental side, that was a major concern of theirs.
Don, do you have additional thoughts, both, I guess, in theory and in the political economy?
Sure. So again, I mean, at a high level, the economist theories put a price on carbon. And cap and trade and tax are both good ways to do that. In a perfect world, you would do them as broadly as you could, right? So that everywhere throughout the economy, the price of carbon would filter through and people would have an incentive to conserve and think of creative ways to cut back. You can make cap and trade and tax look more like each other if you put like some bounds on what prices are for tradable permits, right? So if the price falls too low, you take some in, right? If the price gets too high, you issue some more. You can do some things to try to calibrate the tax rate in principle to what emissions levels are. So in principle, you can make them merge, but in practice they feel different. Tax has this political economic challenge that involves the word tax. You will see, right, there are bills pending now, and there are lots of my friends who talk about, try to train everyone to say fee. Contribution, there are whole discussions about what words you use, which they're fun to say. I actually think they matter, judging from my experience with kind of communication of economic issues, but the reality is an awful lot of people see through those relatively straightforward. And also, politically, one of the great attractions and dangers of a cap and trade system is it creates a currency that you can use politically, so that from a kind of political economics of getting something enacted point of view, you get allowances that you can then distribute to various people to try to get buy-in. And so I think one of the lessons of cap and trade in the 1990s for SO2 was that was actually a very attractive thing, right? You could build political coalitions by using allowances as currency to build a coalition. The downside of that is it isn't particularly transparent. There is another view which I tend to associate more with today, which is that it's also helpful to raise some revenue. Revenue lets you do some things that can also build your political coalition. There's a lot of interest in using tax revenue as a way to finance other tax reforms, right? So it include carbon as part of an overall tax effort. Your mileage may vary. But it also generates revenue that you might be able to use to help the people who are harmed by enacting, an aggressive policy to cut down carbon emissions, whether to help low-income folks, to help coal miners transition, whatever. You can generate revenue also with cap and trade if you're willing to auction the allowances, and previous proposals would have done that in the out years. But view them as, most economists would be pretty comfortable with either approach, particularly if you do some of the things that make cap and trade look more like a tax. The experience in 2009 sort of left cap and trade as a bad taste in the mouth of many people in political circles, which is why I think a lot of the attention is focused more on the tax side recently, although people haven't been able to solve the T-word problem just yet.
And would it be more comprehensive then in terms of tax, or I guess it just depends, as you were saying, kind of the piecemeal
Really depends how you design it. I mean, because in principle, in either system, you need a mechanism of enforcement that aligns either you're paying the tax or you're owning an allowance with the stuff you emitted. And so in principle, those are very similar to one another. Allowances create issues about, banking over time and how do you keep track of this year and next year. And then both of them obviously face this question about what you want your trajectory to look like. Whereas I think most proposals, both for allowance systems and for tax systems, would have a tightening over time. But in principle, you could do that either by bringing down the cap or by raising the tax rate. And then you have the point that was raised previously, was just the uncertainty, right? Which would you rather be uncertain to be about, the price that people are going to pay or the emissions that you hit? And people differ on that.
So the thing I'd like to add to that, of course, is we heard about how environmental groups didn't like the possibility that a tax could necessarily lead to an unbounded amount of emissions. I think that on the investor side of things, they don't like the possibility of permits getting to be so expensive that they have a huge stranded capital problem. So there's both sides to that. One thing I think the economics community is starting to talk about now that we haven't heard a lot about in thinking about the relative merits of these two policy tools is exactly that idea that to the extent that what we want out of environmental policies is some kind of turnover in the capital stock, so we want to go from having a bunch of older, dirtier plants to a bunch of newer, cleaner plants. The sort of stability of investment incentives facilitate that over a shorter time horizon, perhaps at lower costs, than the kinds of investment incentives you might get under a cap and trade scheme in which carbon prices could very well be quite volatile. So it's one of the trade-offs that co-author and I are sort of trying to work through.
One of the lessons, I think, from the cap and trade program that was very successful from SO2, and also that we experienced in the recent MATS program, which is now sent back to EPA, but it's the program that reduces mercury emissions, is it's really important to look for new technologies that can achieve the results you want at a lower cost than everybody else assumed. Okay, that's what happened with the SO2 program because folks went out west and they used low sulfur coal instead of putting on scrubbers, and it was a lot cheaper. That's what happened. There was a big change in the MATS program when EPA changed the technologies that were allowed and found a lower cost technology, particularly lower cost capital technology, made it a lot easier for utilities to comply with some of their gas plants. So again, I always say, it's really, do not assume that the world is going to be static. You need to look. Technology is a real driver in this place. And finally, my experience from the cap and trade program and that whole debate in 2009 is what the politicians will say is it's always nicer to lower prices than to raise them. And there are a lot of folks who really got burned by voting for what was perceived as a high-cost program.
Any other thoughts on the tax issue?
Before we get too, at least away from the other alternatives theme, one thing to keep in mind is, given the political headwinds to comprehensive legislation, whether it be around cap and trade, tax, or whatever, one possibility, and frankly maybe a more realistic possibility given the current political dynamic, is an alternative within the Clean Air Act itself. There are other tools that EPA could use, and I'm sure that there are plenty of folks at EPA burning the midnight biodiesel oil right now, trying to figure out what those other tools are, one of which might be National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So there may be other approaches that if the Clean Power Plan, if the Section 111 approach fails from a judicial review, from a legal perspective, there may be other avenues that we see being developed relatively quickly that wouldn't be subject to the same type of political dynamic. And I don't know, Tom, maybe you've been involved in some of those discussions in your days.
Or maybe this actually can help set up a transition talking about the international piece, because there was a lengthy report recently released by people at some law schools, not the University of Chicago, but by some other ones, talking about something called Section 115, which talks about basically if another, and I'll defer to Tom here, but the general gist is that because of what another country does about air pollution, we can match essentially what, or do something in response to that. So maybe you can explain that possibility, and then we can move to sort of talking about Paris and what that might mean.
Sure. So the question is, let's assume Section 111 doesn't withstand judicial review, or this rule doesn't withstand judicial review. We've made a commitment to our international partners to reduce emissions by 30%. We've made that commitment in Paris. Well, we've made a voluntary commitment in Paris. We've made a commitment as well to China. If you can only get 2 to 3% using Section 111, what else do you have? As Jeff just said, one thing you might do is you might look to the National Ambient Air Quality sections of the Clean Air Act, sections 108 through 110, which we use right now for regulating what we refer to as conventional air pollutants like nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, lead, particulates, ozone, and so forth. One could conceivably, and EPA has the authority to add pollutants to the list of conventional pollutants regulated or criteria pollutants regulated by these sections. You could add carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases more generally to that list. There are problems with doing that. One is that national ambient air quality standards have to be something that you can attain. You have to be able to take steps within your particular region of the country to get you to what we refer to as the requisite level of the pollutant, a level that is sufficiently low to be protective of public health with an adequate margin of safety or protective of welfare. What is that level for something like carbon dioxide that's a global pollutant that causes this global harm of warming? How you would define whether your particular area meets the standard is very difficult. And how any area then proves that it has attained that standard is even more complicated. So it's not an ideal tool. We're once again trying to cram square pegs into round holes because, as has been said, the Clean Air Act is really not the ideal tool for this. What else have you got? You've got Section 112, the hazardous air pollutants section, the mercury and air toxic standards, MATS, that Ed was talking about. You could conceive perhaps of an EPA trying to define carbon dioxide as a hazardous air pollutant because of the effects that it has on health and welfare. Difficult to see how you can get there. Carbon dioxide is somewhat ubiquitous. It's not killing us by breathing it. It's hurting us through these indirect effects on climate. But that allows very stringent regulations. The third option is Section 115. Section 115 has not really been utilized before. It says that where you have a pollutant that is causing adverse effects in another country, you can require the states to address that pollutant in their state plans and reduce that pollutant's emissions to the same extent that the foreign country is obligated to reduce them on behalf of the United States. Now that's the key. And it's the reason why I'm not sure right now it's a viable tool. The Paris Accord, COP21, is purely voluntary. No country has rights against any other country under the Paris Accord. And Section 115 specifically requires that the country with whom and against whom you're acting have reciprocal enforceable rights against us. Since we have no binding legal obligations to them, they can demand nothing binding of us and vice versa. So 115 isn't really available to us right now. It could become available down the road as countries start to make binding commitments. But query whether any country really wants to give to another country enforceable legal rights against them. That's a ceding of sovereignty to another nation. Very, very controversial. So while 115 is out there, I don't see it as truly viable. And this is why, once again, I think we get back to, let's think about other legislation that might give us more viable tools, be it carbon taxes or cap and trade or something that's truly novel that we haven't thought of yet.
Other thoughts on the international piece, anybody? Thoughts on alternatives?
You know, I will say one more thing about the international. We have made large commitments to our trading partners, to our international community about emission reductions. If this rule goes down, and even putting aside what EPA could do about greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, there are a host of other emissions out there that the agency is intending to address and that could nonetheless get us a significant portion of those emission reductions. Methane from oil and gas operations is EPA's next target. Those are significant emissions. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, so you get a lot more bang for the buck from reducing methane emissions than you do from reducing CO2. It may be that there aren't as many of them that are as easily addressable because you have this question of fugitive methane emissions. Very, very difficult to address. But the administration looks to be on track to meet its goals, whether this plan is upheld or not.
So, as I said at the beginning, we would love to have some questions from the audience. If people could write down their questions on cards, and then do we have somebody to collect them? Great. Claiborne will collect.
We'll be happy to collect them if you have any questions that you'd like to address.
I'll be on this side.
Give me 1 second. So we're just going to give me 1 more second to try to group these a little bit. So we're asking for some one question is asking for some prognostication about the DC circuit. Not substance, but kind of more procedure. How likely is it that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals will consider the decision en banc, which will push back the timeline even farther?
Historically speaking, rarely is en banc rehearing granted. There have been a few, but not many. I think probably in this instance, the likelihood is pretty low. First of all, you've got almost an assurance that the Supreme Court's going to hear the case anyway. So I think probably it has become a matter of practice to request rehearing and rehearing en banc at the DC Circuit. I don't actually know if it's required by the court's rules. I don't believe it is, so it is not. So I think it is possible that either petitioners would immediately file, or the unsuccessful party would immediately file for a writ of cert with the Supreme Court. But it's also possible that given the stay, that there may be a reason to request rehearing en banc before filing writs with petition for writ with the Supreme Court. Other guesses?
No, I agree with all of that. It is not required that en banc be sought. The DC Circuit grants at most about 1 en banc case a year, at most. The last case I can think of that they actually decided to hear en banc was, my gosh, they were going to take up the Affordable Care Act case, but the Supreme Court then beat them to the punch and took up the case out of the Fourth Circuit instead. So even there, they didn't actually get to hear the case en banc. So I think it's very unlikely the court would take it. There are 3 very respected jurists on this case, and, whatever their decision is going to be, I think the Supreme Court is going to be presented with that post haste, and, very good chance you've got 4 votes for cert. The big question mark being, who is that 9th justice? And does the Supreme Court want to take it up before they know who that 9th justice is? Who knows? Now we're speculating.
Which may be a basis for asking for rehearing and rehearing en banc to give more time for that to play out.
So shifting to a design feature which we didn't talk about as much under the Clean Power Plan. In Maryland, ozone transport and air pollution from out-of-state stationary sources is about, it says here, 70% of the pollution in Maryland, making interstate collaboration critical. So this is what I want to pick up under the Clean Power Plan. How would you envision the Clean Power Plan's role in interstate efforts to curb transport of air pollution? So under the Clean Power Plan, there was this idea that states could have trading-ready programs, and maybe someone could speak to that. I don't know if somebody also wants to speak to, sorry to be a lawyer here, but EME Homer and interstate trading as well, and other things as well. So, Ed, do you want to speak to the interstate piece?
Yeah, I was just trying to think about it. I think the assumption with carbon is it's unlike some of the other pollutants because the assumption is that it's relatively the same amount wherever you go.
Right, but in terms of interstate collaboration, there's still a lot of talk about interstate collaboration.
You're talking about in terms of the interstate collaboration and trading. There have been a lot of talks about that. It is done in the area we call RGGI, which is the mid-Atlantic states and some of them and part of New England. EPA clearly was on the road to encourage that through the way they had set up their proposed federal plan, which was intended to promote trading, and there were 2 systems, the mass-based and the rate-based. And if you understand it, God bless you, but just know there were 2 systems there. I think most folks tend to think, in most cases, those are advantageous because they help you get the lowest cost result. But the politics are uncertain, and politics plays a major role in these cases. But at the same time, the economics, if they're compelling, will probably lead states to that if we get there.
Any thoughts from the economists?
Richard, the question, like with respect to accounting for the emissions?
I guess more, from, would you rather see fewer larger markets or more state-by-state markets?
I mean, I guess my opinion is that it doesn't matter, and as long as we hit like the national objective. And I know the way the Clean Power Plan is written is if states do collaborate, then they almost have to combine their goals. So if it was mass-based, now they have to reach the total mass of each state combined, and how they choose to do that is up to them as long as they reach that target. And then the same with the rate, they would do like a weighted average weight across all the states. So either way, it would still accomplish the goal. I know one of the shortcomings with RGGI was it didn't take into account emissions from a state that was outside of RGGI. If they exported it into a RGGI state, then there was this leakage, which I believe the Clean Power Plan has attempted to address.
So there are a handful of questions here about renewable energy, or that kind of touch on that. So I'll just read them all here, and then folks can comment on them. So one is, early action wasn't always rewarded under the Clean Power Plan. Are utilities concerned about adding renewables now and not getting credit down the line? Another question, which I think is related because we talked about transmission in the context of renewables, is the siting challenge for transmission enough to prevent states from successfully implementing the Clean Power Plans in their states? And then kind of another one which relates to natural gas, but renewables. Is natural gas an essential bridge to a low carbon future, or a competitor to wind and solar that only slows progress to renewables?
I like that last one. Who asked that? Right now, we don't have a lot of alternatives to using natural gas as a backup. So again, that's sort of where I talk about the technology piece as being essential. It's either nuclear or natural gas, unless somebody comes up with some great storage, and a lot of folks are working on that. What was that first question again, though? About early action?
Yeah, but are utilities worried about investing in renewables now and not getting credit down the line?
There has always been concern about not getting credit for early action. Like there's so many, and that's one of so many millions of uncertainties as to what new program might be devised and how it's set up, and whether you're advantaged or not. It becomes very difficult, but I think most utilities are really trying to focus right now on what makes economic sense currently and is a win-win deal for everybody. That's probably your best bet for the moment with all the uncertainties out there.
Yeah, and I would say that, depending on the program, they would still get credit. And one piece that we didn't really discuss, I believe, is a clean energy investment program, where if they're making some of these early investments, they will get allowances, say in a mass-based program, that they could apply once the Clean Power Plan goes into effect. And that addresses both renewables and investments in energy efficiency. And any investments they make now, if they were to adopt, say, a mass-based program, would just further allow them to reach their target. And the renewables will get, if we go to allowances that they could then sell back.
But I hate to be the gloomy economist here, but if you've got a program that is going to reward people for past behavior, then you're not actually getting anything out of the program in the first place, right? So that's going to be a tough sort of efficiency challenge of any of these programs that certain utilities may be thinking about trying to make investments today that they'll get credit for tomorrow. At least it'll be hard for people like me to try to measure their efficiency. Don, if you feel differently about that.
I think we'll do one last kind of set of questions here, shifting topics, and then we'll wind up. So one's more of a fact question, but I think it relates to the broader question. In light of the fact that so much coal is burned in India and China, what percentage of the world's coal is burned in coal-fired power plants in the U.S.? And do you think that President Obama really expected this World to Survive challenge, or only enacted it to pressure China and India to reduce their consumption?
Let me say, as somebody who is also counsel to folks who are opposing the rule, I will give a lot of credit to the lawyers at EPA who were very creative in coming up with their rationale for the rule. I think it is fair to say it is questionable whether or not it will succeed, but they were really thoughtful and creative. And, I think they legitimately put a lot of time and effort into doing what they thought they could do with what admittedly is a poorly written Clean Air Act. It was not written for the kinds of circumstances they're facing now. I don't know anybody can speak for President Obama and why he did what he did, but they really tried hard to make something work, and we'll see whether or not they succeeded.
Well, I want to please join me in thanking all of our panelists. And I think folks may be around for a little bit, so if I didn't get to one of your questions, or if you had other ones, you can definitely come up and chat with us afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Carolyn, do you have anything else?
A couple more things. Just a few acknowledgments before we leave. Once again, I thank our panel and our wonderful sponsors, the Law School, the Booth School of Business, EPIC, the Alumni Law Society, Pillsbury. Everyone's been wonderful, and everyone worked hard to make this program happen. There are lots of administrative people we'd like to thank as well. There's one, Tim, from the Booth School of Business, and Denise. There's Allison. Is Allison in the room? She's from the law school. There's Lucy from the Alumni Law Society, and Victoria. I saw her somewhere. Oh, there she is. She's in the back from EPIC. Wonderful to work with everyone. Everyone's been great in helping this happen and making this happen. Another acknowledgement is the team that helped us all pull this together tonight. They're all sitting at this table here. There's Fatima, there's Chuck, there's Michael, and there's Ruan, and Claiborne back there, along with myself. We've spent 6 months at this, and saw a lot of change along the way, and just made it a really incredible experience for us all. Having said all that, this concludes our program for tonight. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, panel. Good night.